So hi everyone, thanks for coming tonight. We're going to have 3 talks, if I understand correctly, about trees tonight in our region. I'll be leading off talking about mostly about kind of the indigenous trees of our area, so trees that would have been found growing in Russell and Eastern Ontario generally. If you were an explorer here, say, 1800s early or even before that. Trees, they've changed quite a bit since then, of course. Much of the land has been cleared for agriculture, which is, I think, something everybody is well aware of. Pretty much all of Eastern Ontario would have been mature forest as little as 180 years ago. Now, most of it, if you look on satellite, at least where you can farm, is open land. But many trees still exist, of course, and many of the species and things are changing as well. So a lot of the native species have declined in terms of abundance, and many species from across oceans have arrived on our shores and are doing quite well for themselves. So we'll talk about things such as this. I first wanted to show a tree that maybe you've noticed, my first slide, maybe not. This is near Carlsbad Springs at the intersection of Russell and Leitrim Roads, if I'm remembering correctly. Has anyone seen a very large tree at that intersection before driving around? Anyone want to guess what kind of tree that is? Just based on what the growth form looks like?
I don't count. We don't count.
Anyone who doesn't know? So that's an American elm. So probably most of you are familiar with that name of tree, and probably most of you actually know that tree. But that's one of the most famous trees in the world, frankly, but especially North America. In North America, we often think of kind of a big 3 native trees east of the Rockies that everyone kind of knows, or at least knew about. American elm being one, which is famous as growing kind of as a vase shape or umbrella shape. This one's kind of more of a weeping willow shape. The species is quite famous for having a wide variety of growth forms, although it's still all of like elm. And of course, sugar maple. Who doesn't know that one? That's one of the other big 3 very famous trees. That's broadleaf anyway. And the third one, which is more of an American tree but does range into Canada, is white oak. In Russell, we don't have really any white oak, although Ottawa has a few and the Gatineau Hills have some. And then south of us, it's a very common tree. Into the States, it's one of the most important trees. We have bur oak here, which is very similar, closer to Green. And of course, the 4th tree I might mention to round it out for a conifer is, of course, Eastern white pine. Everybody seems to know that one too, of course, because it's famous for being very tall and very useful to make masts and that sort of thing. Okay, one thing I want to show here is that this photograph was only taken about 2 years ago. I just happened to be driving down the road when the sun was coming up, and a lot of people I talk to about trees tell me things like, oh, but American elm, that's been affected by Dutch elm disease, they're all gone. I just wanted to sort of share with as many audience as I can, actually. This is one species of many that have had declines due to diseases and pests that have been brought in from other continents. American elm has been badly affected, but there's actually still many large ones out there today. So the diameter of this tree, I did measure it because it was so big, it's 5 feet diameter at ground level. So it's a full-size American elm, and there are a few of them out there still. Next slide, please. Now, what did it look like not that long ago? So this is a photograph, 1973, about 2 kilometers north of here, North Russell. That's my mother just standing with a for sale sign, I think, of the property she just purchased. And pretty much, not exactly every tree, but like almost every tree you see here is an American elm. And there's actually one kind of weird one here. This one is actually a rare elm these days. It's rock elm, which has also been affected by Dutch elm disease. Almost all those trees, 1973, almost all those trees were alive in 73. I think 1 or 2 of them was dying / dead from Dutch elm disease, this invasive fungus from East Asia. And by 1976, only 1 or 2 of them were still alive. So in a span of about 3 years, pretty much everything died. Because basically the disease rolled into town. And it's kind of like, diseases with certain animals and things as well too, where you have, you know how with Ebola, basically, if you have a person who's recently died, it's actually the most dangerous time to be around, the disease per se, because the disease is just coming out of this recently dead person. With elms, it's actually the exact same situation. If they're recently dead or dying, just about to die, they're actually the most full of the pathogen, and it's very likely that neighboring trees will be affected. So basically 1 or 2 of them got it. Within 3 years, almost all of them had it. Next slide, please. But not all of them. So this is actually one of the trees that survived. This tree was 110 feet tall. I measured it several times via trigonometry because I didn't have my laser device back then. But anyways, this is a very, very tall American elm. One reason why it was so tall is there was other trees right beside it along this fence line that had forced it to grow tall. So basically it was almost like a forest tree, but the forest was gone around it, and it was still tall because it wanted to still be tall. Now this photograph was taken in 1995, so about 20 years after the disease rolled into town. So this tree obviously was exposed to the disease and survived the disease, but of course exposure, getting disease, dying from disease is not a binary thing. You sometimes get sick and get over it, sometimes you get sick again. This tree actually did die of Dutch elm disease about 10 years ago, around 2005, and it's gone now. Next slide, please. Okay, this is 1981, this same fence row in North Russell. I just wanted to show another sort of interesting thing that I happened to notice as a kid in my home yard. So these are elms that have died from Dutch elm disease. First, note how different they look. So the one that I showed in my first sunrise photo, I said it's kind of a weeping willow form. That's kind of what this guy would have been looking like. This one has a very different branching pattern from this very typical kind of funnel-shaped one, but they're the same species. Way back here, I don't know if you can see this, there's like a dark blob there. That's about 1 kilometer from my house. And I remember as a kid, I'd see this really tall conifer, way over there. Eventually, when I was a bit older, this is 1981, probably around almost 10 years after, so 1990, I got the courage just to sort of walk over there and have a look, and what is this thing? And that was a very, very tall white spruce, old growth white spruce. This happened to be, this sort of mass of trees here, just happened to be a remnant, more or less, old growth forest, never been cleared for agriculture. So many, many large trees. This spruce was just sort of a super canopy tree that was much taller than the surrounding trees around it. But nothing lasts forever. Next slide, please. That same tree I noticed one day was gone. So, that's kind of weird, I wonder what happened. So I just happened to be kind of, curious, shall we say, so I could just sort of, I wonder what's going on in there. So I walked in and I found, to my pleasant surprise, nothing nefarious with human hands had occurred, but basically the tree had just probably come down in a windstorm. Nothing lasts forever. So this spruce, which is, you see there's the stump and it fell over this way, may have had a little bit of what's called butt rot at the base, kind of a funny term. Basically, old trees often get fungal agents and things, and they get a little bit sick as they get older. This tree just would have snapped very suddenly, probably one windy day like today, and gone, and that tree would not be there if I grown up one generation later. I would have never seen it. Next slide, please. So trees are often considered integral to human health and well-being, and I think it's true. I think most people, even if you're, kind of a closet nature lover, most people seem to have an affinity to trees. And I just wanted to show, this is from a book in 1917. This is before Dutch elm disease arrived in North America. I don't know if you can see there's like a Model T or two there. There's some people. That's a full-sized American elm in New England somewhere. That tree's gigantic. And so basically they were famous for being about 10 feet diameter or so sometimes. Not quite the same size as the West Coast trees, but maybe half the size of these trees as the West Coast trees. Very, very large trees. And you're not going to find any American elms that size today because, let's say 98% of them died from disease and whatever else, there's just none of them left really today. But there's some big ones that are half that size today. Next slide, please. Okay, now trees are also for, wildlife considered sort of the vertical landscape, something to think about in terms of just sort of healthy landscapes. We often think about kind of the square, kilometer or acreage, but actually this shows old growth white pines that are behind the Bell Arena in Ottawa. These are 130 feet tall, by the way. But, you have like a skyscraper landscape where basically various animals, insects, fungi, other life forms will be living as well. So trees actually really, healthy forests multiply basically the available space it's hard to overestimate how much they multiply the available space for life, because basically you have a third dimension of frontage for life to set up shop in. And so these white pines that are really, really tall, just if you walk in behind the Bell Arena there, those are almost as tall as the ones in Gilly Grove and Armprior. You'll basically just be like, wow, there's so much wildlife right above my head there. Some of it kind of sounds distant because they're so high above my head. Next slide, please. Okay, now, one question is how healthy are the trees themselves? And one of the reasons why I'm so motivated to give kind of public awareness talk, shall we say, is that actually there's a lot of problems, a surprising amount of problems, if you don't know about the problems, with respect to trees that don't, everybody knows about animals going extinct, which is actually probably the most pressing problem today because, populations are very low of many large animals especially, right? They need large territories and whatever. that is the most pressing concern for wildlife. But actually, trees, in terms of the non-large animal wildlife, they might be a runner-up. So trees are plants, obviously, but they're kind of different from most other plants in the sense they have a lot of diseasable target that's there for a long time. You know, you grow a wildflower patch or so on, maybe something comes in and deer come in and eat the patch, but plants that don't live a long time are very adept typically of spreading around and kind of, you lose some here, gain some there. It's kind of a balance. Trees are quite different. They basically set up shop, and their plan is to live there for 2 or 3 human lifespans typically for centuries. They're kind of on the century scale. So if you have diseases and problems come in, they're much more susceptible to be just sitting targets that don't really get around so well. And their mobility in terms of seed dispersal is typically lower than most other plants, or many other plants. So here's 2 common problems today. One would be hot summers. So that's a white spruce on your left. That photograph was taken in Ottawa, near where I live today. But at Russell Public School, you may have noticed some conifers died in the last few years there too. They're also white spruce, and they also almost all died from effects of the drought of 2012 was the big one. There was also a drought in, I think it was 2017. Was the last summer or the summer before? 2016? Yeah, 2016. Second drought that killed off many, many other trees too. So this was taken early 2013 when the winter was just kind of like now, like winter was just ending. This tree had been mortally injured by the drought of 2012 and was just slowly dying. And here on the right, I want to show something else. This Russell Public School, which I'm sure many of you know where that is. That's where I went to school as a kid. These are all green ash. You've probably heard of the ash borer by now. So there's an invasive insect from East Asia that basically kills, unlike the elms where kind of just most of them die, and some live, basically every single ash, 99.99 something or other, dies from basically just being eaten to death by this insect. So in East Asia, there's ashes, and this insect targets ashes. In East Asia, where the trees and the insect are both hail from, there's a balance, right? The trees have co-evolved with this insect. They know how to poison the insect. The insect takes out trees that are kind of weak or dying or what have you. The ashes that are almost identical in North America are missing one key ingredient: exposure to this insect for long periods of time. There's other insects that eat ash here, and the ash aren't wimps. They're very, very tough actually, but they're miscalibrated for the emerald ash borer. So the emerald ash borer hitches a ride across the ocean through globalization, and oh look, there's food everywhere. I'm going to eat all of it because the food can't defend itself. So that's why the ash trees basically are just sitting ducks and dying right now. Probably a few will survive, a very, very few. In some sense, later on, like the chestnut blight, if you've heard of that, where almost every single chestnut died, there were a few survivors. I think there'll be a very small percentage that do survive, and they probably will just by chance have been somewhat distasteful to the insect. We will see what happens. It's still an evolving story. Next slide, please. Okay, now I just wanted to show kind of, I mentioned in the beginning, most of Ontario was an old growth forest, so to speak, as recently as 1830 or thereabouts. If you look in the book Swamp and Shanty, which is the Russell historical book, talks a bit about when deforestation started here. This is what basically, where I'm standing and where your homes would have looked like under 200 years ago. This is an old growth forest, conifer heavy, so you've got these kind of darker trunks here, Eastern Hemlock, which is a conifer that's native here. These kind of flaky looking trunks are red spruce. And you've got yellow birch and sugar maple and everything else in there too. I just want you to have just get an impression what that looks like and how you could, kind of run through here and play catch, and it's kind of open and airy, big trees. Next slide, please. What we mostly have today looks more like this, at least if it's heavily degraded. This is very, very young forest in Barhaven where my son plays baseball. And all these white trunks. Do you ever wonder why some trees have white trunks? Prevailing theory is that white helps reflect sunlight in basically open areas, where you kind of like open, airy conditions where it's not deep forest. So paper birch, and you have one trembling aspen in here too, which also has typically white bark. They're adapted to reflect heat if they're kind of in open, windy environments. Trees that have the darker bark, you basically don't have this adaptation for young forests. So you see a forest full of white trees. Those are trees that are basically evolved to be the first ones that move in once forest is allowed to regrow. So next slide, please. Okay, I want to show a bit of the change that's occurred in North America in the last few decades. So this is a website you should just check out sometime if you're on the computer, globalforestwatch.org. This shows basically, based on satellite data for Google Satellite, change in forest cover over area over time. And the standard setting is for 12 years. So you go back, 2018 now, you go back to 2006. And what you see is pink color is forest loss, and blue color is forest gain. And so if you look at all of Canada, you'll see the boreal forest, there's huge areas of pink where you maybe have forest fires, but also large-scale logging operations. And if you look where most of the forest has already been it's kind of settled out, where humans have been for a century or two, and if the choice cuts have already been taken, and also a lot of civilization, towns and yards and things are established, there's much smaller color change. But we're going to zoom in. Next slide, please. I'm going to zoom in our area. You see again these big color changes to our north and so on. Much smaller change here. Let's zoom in again. Next slide. Okay, so there's Ottawa, and you got Russell here. You see it's mostly pink. Pink being forest loss. Next slide, please. We'll just stop there for a sec. So basically, Russell here, and Embrun, and then Ottawa's just over here. There's that cut by the 417 you may have seen a few years ago. Still, just take in that most of it's still pink. So definitely there was a minimum in forest cover in Eastern Ontario around 1900, Eastern North America generally. Most of the clear-cutting frenzy occurred from 1850 to 1900, but then a lot of recovery occurred basically to changing economics and industrialization of agriculture and so on. But today we're actually in a trend of losing forest again. And something else just to note, so pink being loss, blue, there's some blue, it's gain. Keep in mind that pink could be a forest that's 12 years old, or 100 years old, or 200 years old, or 500 years old. Blue would mean the forest is 12 years or less old. So it's not really a forest, it's kind of forest, but it's bush. Next slide, please. Okay, native trees in general, this is I think what I kind of advertised to talk about today. Generally, let's generalize. Generally, they're infrequently planted. So most of the plantings you see kind of along boulevards and so on are not typically trees that are from this area historically. There's enormous and continuing change in population since European settlement. So basically, many trees have declined in very large numbers in population. Some have increased, like those white bark trees have actually probably increased typically. And there actually is emerging scientific conservation concern for trees. I'm just going to show what these two are. So here you have two mature trees on Montreal Road in Ottawa beside a subway. This is a slippery elm, which is kind of a mysterious tree. Very few botanists really know much about this tree, actually, when I talk to them anyway. And this is a rock elm. This is this other, we have three species here. They look kind of different from each other. Note they're not really vase-shaped and not really looking like American elms. So those are the two other ones that also do grow here, but they're pretty uncommon. Next slide, please. Okay, just to show you a headline from one article in a series of articles that were written on Canadian forest health in early 2000s, around 2000 to 2005 or so. This article is from 2006. Survey of tree species of concern in Canada, the role for genetic conservation. So trees are life forms that have genetics. If you get inbred, for example, from having a low population, right? We all know that low populations are bad because recessive genes that are bad become prominent. So, you might get various bad effects on your population. Trees are actually the same exact situation. They have genetics and they have to fight many pests which want to eat their wood and their bark and their leaves. And so if you do a lot of cutting and not much replenishment, their populations get low. So this article is free to download, by the way, at least it was last time I checked. You can read yourself. The recommendations of this article were that 52% of Canadian tree species required active conservation concern measures to remain viable. So basically, the populations of over half the Canadian tree species were low enough to be, in the opinion of these authors, concerning. It's basically like they're getting inbred already. This is from 2006. This is 12 years ago. I'm going to note something else too. So 52% of Canada's trees, most of the trees that are requiring conservation active measures are actually in eastern Canada, here. So here it's around 2/3 actually. Next slide, please. Okay, if you look at like your local strip mall, what are you going to see what's kind of been planted typically in recent decades? So this is to illustrate a point. Sorry for the kind of arrows everywhere, but the arrows are actually all pointing at a tree that looks kind of similar. The tree that they're pointing at is one of the most commonly planted trees in our region, which is European little-leaf linden, close relative of the American basswood. But if you look at your strip mall, you're almost never today going to see American basswood planted for whatever reason. European linden is the one that's planted. And ironically, European linden is considered kind of threatened in much of Europe where it's native to because of not being planted and being logged too much. Next slide, please. Now, the assumption typically has been you plant it at the strip mall, you plant it in your backyard, it stays there. Actually, experience has definitively shown by now it's the exception to the rule if you plant industrial scale plantings of some kind of plant that it stays where you plant it. So if you look across the road in the forest beside the strip mall, what do you see? This is after Halloween. This is European linden, which stays green late into autumn because it's in tune with the Gulf Stream of Western Europe. Staying green, all the native trees have lost all their leaves already. This is basically becoming a potentially invasive species, one of many actually. Next slide, please. Okay, after Dutch elm disease, about 100 years ago, we decided we'd start planting an elm tree called Siberian elm on a massive scale because it is immune to Dutch elm disease because that's where, again, it co-evolved with Dutch elm disease. And it's kind of a weedy, fast-growing tree, so we'll replace American elm. In 100 years, roughly, these blue marks show where Siberian elm is today growing wild in North America. So in one human lifespan, it went from not being here, essentially, to being literally everywhere. Just to show how fast you can change a continent's flora if you want to. Pink is actually where it's officially invasive. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to sort of hammer on the point. So we could probably are due for a bit of a behavioral change in terms of at least the ecological responsibility of our flora. And horticulturalists, everyone's talking about it to a degree, and some action is actually being placed. So if you go look at certain New England states in particular, there actually are a lot of species of shrubs and trees that are actually officially banned today. I'm not saying really all of them should be banned, maybe some, maybe not. Basically, there's a lot of action just starting to happen now where it's like, wow, that thing that we planted for 50 years is everywhere now because it's invasive, banned. But then often the action is to bring in kind of another thing to replace it. So we're kind of sort of feeling out the best way to proceed with how to have our natural forest healthy and avoid having too many so-called invasive species where it kind of loses the meaning of being invasive. Next slide, please. So one thing you can do, actually growing trees from seed. This is a book that I recommend everyone having a look at, probably in the library here, I hope. Written by a guy in Southwest Ontario, Henry Koch. Great book. Basically, growing trees is about as difficult as growing your vegetable garden. Seeds, they germinate, you put them in potting soil, you protect them from rodents, and within a year or two, this high, year 3, they're this high, year 4, they're as high as me, and then you have a tree. Next slide, please. So that's what my deck looks like very often. I'm actually growing a lot of trees. Amazingly, my wife is not divorcing me over this. I guess she just thinks I'm kind of on a mission or something. I grow a lot of these trees that are kind of neglected personally. I kind of give them to people. A lot of other people do this too. But I don't do it in any commercial sense. It's just basically I have time. I grab a few seeds as I'm kind of in the conservation area. If you're allowed to collect, especially fence lines and things, just, grow. Next slide. So, 2 things I want to mention. So actually preserving what's already here. This is a so-called old growth forest near Russell. It's probably the easiest thing you can do. Just don't cut kind of what's there, and you kind of got what's there, and you can kind of collect seeds from that forest and restore other areas without having. Next slide, please. Much more difficult is what I call sort of active restoration of converted land. This was a planting in Embrun I did with Steve from Trees for Tomorrow a few years ago at was it Bordeaux Park, I believe. Basically, over a weekend in May, we were given permission to plant many native trees in a kind of unused corner of this large park. And next slide, please. At least you can kind of bring the trees back. There's my mother again, modeling beside a uncommon and mysterious slippery elm, which grew from here the following year to here. So very, very happy to be released into this park to help restore the native forest. Interesting note, these trees were dug up by, enthusiastic volunteers who typically didn't really know how best to dig up trees. Some of these trees are basically very, very few roots and kind of on death's door when we move them. But actually, trees are tough, right? So if you just give them a tiny little bit of TLC, often they grow very healthy, very, very quickly. So that's literally the next year after a tree that was transplanted from a rocky quarry site into a healthy, fertile soil. Next slide, please. Okay. I gotta talk about this particular species too. So you guys know about spruces, right? There's of course the blue spruce, and you got probably white spruce. You probably know about from conservation plantings and things. There's actually an interesting story around Ottawa regarding this so-called red spruce. There's actually 2 other native species here besides white spruce. There's black spruce, which is pretty famous in bogs, kind of restricted to bogs and wetlands. And then you've got red spruce, which everybody's heard about, but nobody really knows where to find one. Well, this photograph was taken along Anderson Road about 2 months ago. And this is a 76-foot tall old-growth red spruce. There's actually larger red spruce in that area. This tree wasn't considered native at Ottawa 12 years ago. There was a report on Ottawa's flora that came out, commissioned by the city of Ottawa. Red spruce noted to grow in Gatineau Park and nearby on the Quebec side, but not in Ottawa. And actually someone who was an old forestry professor read that report of Ottawa and contacted the author and said, I'll show you some red spruce in Ottawa. There's some right there. So the main enemy of trees in terms of conservation really is just obscurity. Red spruce is a fine tree, just like most spruces. A little bit different from the other species, what have you. But they grow really well here, and all you got to do is not cut them down. And if you do cut all of them down, just maybe replant a few, and you still have the population kind of kicking around, right? So these were kind of, Loch Ness monster, Sasquatch, kind of mysterious, mythical creatures that nobody really knew was around Ottawa until you just look and you find them, and they're giant trees, and they're just there the whole time. It's kind of interesting. Like trees, which are huge, often are not documented correctly, even today. Next slide, please. This is show citizen science project, which I'm involved with. This is a mapping of red spruce in eastern Ontario. You see it's sort of scattered. This is kind of the knowledge to date. You see Algonquin Park famously has some too, which is kind of off the scale, but there's one dot that was found by a colleague of mine halfway to Algonquin Park. This species you consider to be kind of uncommon native tree, and to the point of being kind of obscure, and many people thought it wasn't native until we just took photos and showed that they were native. Next slide, please. Okay, you should also be monitoring invasive species, so to speak. So every plant you see here that has green leaves, that leaf you see, is glossy buckthorn, which is from Europe. But I grew up in Russell. This plant was not in Russell as far as I can tell. I was interested in trees as a kid 20, 30 years ago. Wasn't here. So was in Ottawa, Montreal, the big centers where people introduced it from Europe. And birds spread it. It's one of these species that has a little berry sort of fruit. Birds eat it, they fly some distance, poop it out, and then you get kind of concentric circles spreading from the urban centers. So this is now what the Castor River shoreline looks like in some places, of a species that wasn't essentially here a couple decades ago. Buckthorn map that most of these dots are probably me and a few other people. Interestingly enough, I wanted to say something about this. I explored 15 kilometers of trail at Alexandria about 3 months ago. And there was not a single glossy buckthorn in Alexandria's 15 kilometers of trails, although the habitat was perfect for it. It hasn't gotten there yet, quite interesting. It's gotten to Russell, but not to Alexandria yet. And surely it's spreading to there from Ottawa and from Montreal. Montreal's understandable. Next slide. Okay, how am I doing for time?
It's 7:30 right now.
Okay, I'll just finish off a couple more, and then we'll be done in like 3 minutes. We gotta be creative with what we plant too. So this is black maple. This is a close relative of sugar maple. Sugar maple famously does not grow along roadsides well because it's sensitive to roadsides. So because of that, we actually planted Norway maple, typically, to replace the sugar maples. Well, unfortunately, we didn't notice black maple grows really, really well along roadsides, and it's a very, very close relative of sugar maple, which makes maple syrup as well. Has that nice pleasing growth form and autumn color. Basically, it's like a doppelganger twin species of sugar maple, but historically we haven't been planting them on roadsides because we didn't figure out that they were actually suitable for roadsides. Until now. Next slide. So I want to just sort of hammer home the point. You have to plant trees or conserve them. If you just have kind of one sacred tree that gets old and dies, then it kind of gets old and dies. You have to renew them. So you may have seen this article in the paper last week, I think. What's the tallest tree in Ottawa? This was a tall cottonwood that kind of was at the end of its life and going to be cut down. It's kind of unfortunate that, like the tree only lives for 100, 200 years and then you cut it down. It'd be nice if you had maybe, when it was 70 years old, sort of plant a few other of the same type so you kind of have a continuing renewal process. So you just keep in mind always, trees only under the best live around 2 or 3 human lifespans under the best of conditions typically. They get old and they die. Next slide. I want to give some kudos. So there actually is a lot of positive trends at the moment. So basically, for example, the NCC along the canal planted a very obscure native tree, bitternut hickory. I saw them planting this along the canal when I was skating this winter. So a lot of conservation authorities and other authorities who do planting actually want to plant native species, and it's all about demand. Oh, supply is short. If you have demand, there will be supply. So typically, you just have to have awareness and then demand, and then the supply comes. Next slide. Okay, I will stop it there because I sort of rehashed a few points. Any questions?